guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be explaining cut time, and this is going to be a very beginner explanation. This is mainly targeted for beginner musicians or for people who just have trouble understanding cut time in general. First off, I'm going to be explaining the misconceptions that people have about cut time. These are some really common misconceptions that a lot of younger students have. The first one is that a lot of band directors or teachers will say, in order to make it easier for their students to understand, they'll say that cut time is just 4/4 split in half. Now, this isn't the best way to put it because a lot of students would assume that 4/4 split in half is just 2/4. 2/4 is not equivalent to cut time. 2/2 is equivalent to cut time, and we'll get into that later. The second most common misconception that people have about cut time is that some people will say cut time is just a really fast 4/4. This also isn't the best way to put it because how fast is fast enough? This might just end up stressing out students more, especially when they're faced with the sight reading excerpt that has cut time in it, because they'll want to think about it in 4/4, but then they're trying to think about it in a really fast 4/4, and they just can't count fast enough, they can't process it fast enough, and it just makes it a lot more stressful. Now I'm going to be explaining how to properly understand cut time. We need to understand that common time is the equivalent to 4/4. Now, cut time is the equivalent to 2/2. If we look at 4/4, which is the most common time signature, probably the easiest one as well, we know that the top number tells us how many beats are in a measure. The bottom number tells us what kind of note gets that beat. So if we look at 4/4, there's 4 beats, and the quarter note gets the beat. So the top number tells us how many, the bottom number tells us of what. How many of what? So if we look at 2/2, I'm sure you can figure this out yourself now. The top number tells us that there's 2 beats per measure, and the bottom number tells us that the half note gets the beat. So that means in cut time, there are 2 beats, and the half note gets the beat. It's really important to note that cut time is really only used for faster, more upbeat, forward-moving pieces. And by upbeat, I don't necessarily mean in a major key. I just mean like, forward moving, faster kind of feel. If you ever see 2/2 in a piece and you're wondering, well, why didn't they just write cut time? It's because cut time is really only used for faster pieces. So you'll see cut time in a lot of marches, stands tunes, maybe fanfares even. Now we know that in cut time, the half note gets the beat. So what does the quarter note get? The quarter note gets the 8th note pulse because the quarter note is no longer getting the beat because we're not in 4/4, we're in 2/2. What does the 8th note get? The 16th note. What does the 16th note get? The 32nd note, and so on. You kind of just divide it by 2. It's not too complicated. So the concept may seem pretty simple, but there's a catch. If you try to count cut time in actual context, usually it won't end that well because cut time, like I mentioned before, is usually very forward moving and quicker. So by the time you formulate the counts for one measure in your head, you're already on to the next. And we all know that in sight reading concepts, when we're being timed, that's not really gonna work. But don't worry. There's a certain feel to cut time that if you get this kind of feel, if you get this kind of meter in your head, you'll never really have to count cut time again. Unless if you find a super difficult rhythm, as long as you get the feel, you'll never really have to count again. And that kind of goes for every other meter. If you get the feel and you know how certain rhythms should sound, you'll never really have to count it, and everything should just fit like a perfect puzzle piece. So that being said, let's look at some examples so I can teach you how to get that feel and internalize that pulse. Now here's a little disclaimer. In order for this to make utmost sense to you, you already kind of have to know some of your basic rhythms. So the rhythms I'm about to show are very simple and basic, but if you're a complete beginner and you don't really know your rhythms, I recommend maybe you shouldn't start here and then you could come back to this video later. But as long as you know these basic rhythms, then you should be fine for the rest of the video. Alright, so we're going to be starting with the very basics. Here we have 2 half notes per measure and the half note gets the beat, so this should be pretty easy. Before I count the actual rhythm, I'm going to be giving you guys a count off beforehand, so just keep that in mind. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and 1, 2, 1, 2. I know that seemed pretty simple, but this is really important to keep in mind nonetheless. This is the pulse of cut time / 2/2. This is the half note pulse that we just looked at. So it's really important to internalize this because it's going to be what we're working with for the rest of the rhythms that we look at. Of course, the BPM varies piece by piece, but right now we're just going to look at 100 BPM. No matter what BPM you're looking at in cut time, whether it's 100 BPM, 150 BPM, 70 BPM, whatever it may be, you're still going to need to internalize this half note pulse either way. So now we're going to go into the eighth note pulse of cut time. Remember, the quarter note gets the eighth note pulse just like we talked about earlier. So let's go ahead and count this. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and. So I hope that this is becoming a little less confusing to you now that you could see a visual of what's going on. So far we've covered the foundational pulse, which is the half note pulse, and now we're looking at the eighth note subdivision, which just means that the quarter note gets the eighth note pulse because we're at 2/2. Alright, so now we're going to be looking at the 16th note pulse of cut time. But I know you see the 2/2 notation here. Don't fret, remember that 2/2 and cut time are the same exact thing. So, let's get started. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and 1 and a 2 and a 1 and a 2 and a. So just like we talked about earlier, the 8th notes become the 16th note pulse in cut time / 2/2. So the first 8th note is 1. The second one is E, the third one is and, the fourth one is a. So in total it adds up to 1 and a, which equals 1 beat, just subdivided in 16th notes. Alright, so now that we looked at some of those rhythms, let's put some of them together. I'm going to help you out with numbers 1 and 2, and then I'm going to have you do 3 and 4 on your own and then check your answers later. Here we go with number 1. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and 1, 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2, and 1 and 2. Alright, now we're moving on to number 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and 1, 2, 1, 2, 1 and 2, and 1 and 2 and. Feel free to pause the video and figure out number 3. I'm going to give you a count off for number 3 either way, but if you need to pause it, that's fine too. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and. Did you guys get that? I'm going to give you the correct answers. Alright, we're going to do the same exact thing for number 4. It's your turn to figure it out. Once again, feel free to pause the video. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and. Here are the correct answers. So now we're going to go ahead and look at this exercise, but we're specifically going to focus on the last 2 measures first because now we have something new, the dotted half note, and we need to learn how to count that now. So in cut time, the dotted half note gets 1.5 beats, which in context would be counted as 1 and 2. Let's also note that at the last measure of this exercise, the dotted half note actually falls on an off beat since the quarter note gets the first beat. So instead of 1 and 2, that one would actually be counted as and 2 and. Alright, now that we have that in mind, let's try to count this entire exercise. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and 1, 2, and 1, 2, and 1, and 2, and 1, and 2, and. So now I'm going to tizzle the rhythm for you so you actually hear how it's supposed to sound like, since this is a more difficult rhythm that we've looked at so far. Alright, so this is the final exercise that we're going to be looking at today. Now, before we get into it, there are two rhythms in here that we haven't quite learned yet, and that's the dotted quarter note and then the whole note. So in cut time /2/2, the dotted quarter note gets 3/4 of a beat, so it would be counted as 1E and. Now the whole note is pretty self-explanatory. The whole note just gets the full measure, which is just the full 2 beats. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and tizzle the first 2 measures for you so that you know how a dotted quarter note should sound, and then I'm going to have you guys figure out the rest. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and. Alright, so that's how the first 2 measures should sound. I'm going to let you guys pause the video and try to figure out the counts for the rest of the measures, and then I'm going to count you off like we did for the rest of the videos. I know I did the first 2 measures for you, but I'm still going to count off from the beginning so that you get to do the whole exercise yourself. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and. Alright, so now I'm going to show you guys the correct counts, and then after that, I'm going to go ahead and tizzle the rhythm again for you so you know how it should sound. One, 2, 1, 2, ready, and. So now that we looked at those excerpts, I hope that made a lot more sense to you and helped you get a better feel of what cut time is. I'm making this because I used to struggle with cut time a lot, and I used to follow a lot of those misconceptions that I stated earlier. So I really wanted to help younger musicians understand cut time so that they won't be confused in the future. I plan to do more of these videos for other time signatures. If you want a specific time signature, make sure to request it in the comments and I'd be so glad to explain it. Thank you so much for watching, and if this helped you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share to other musicians who might need this help too. Thank you so much.